The First World War, one of the most deadly conflicts in history. A new automated era of fighting and killing. For the first time in history, death comes en masse. It forges the personalities of young men who will later shape the fate of Europe. And prepares the ground for a second, even deadlier conflict. How would history have played out had it not been for the killing fields of the First World War? Berlin, 1914. No sign yet of the nightmare that lies ahead. Alexanderplatz, even livelier than today. Cameras are still a novelty. They stare straight at us, full of curiosity, no trace of the worries to come. This is the pulsating capital of the aspiring German Empire. Foreign soldiers haven't set foot on German soil since Napoleon. These people don't know what war really means, at least not yet. These are modern times. The automobile is met with exuberant enthusiasm right across the Western world. Speed is the drug of the time. The smell of petrol is a favorite perfume.
For the bulk of Europe, the beginning of the 20th century, you could look back on a century of astonishing peace and prosperity and look optimistically at the new century that was just beginning.
Germany is the second strongest industrial power in the world, right after the USA, and it is armed to the teeth. Life is good. In his memoirs, the author Karl Zuckmayer writes, "People felt safe in a world of progress, civilization and humanitarianism. Nobody saw the approaching storm." Munich, 1914. The Bavarian king's homely residential city. This is where a 25-year-old Austrian has found shelter. Adolf Hitler. His future prospects are not encouraging. With no qualifications, he's making a meager living by copying cityscapes. He's in Munich to escape Austrian military service. Even then, Hitler is filled with hatred for people of different ethnicities.
Well, Hitler had been a big supporter of German nationalism. He'd hated the Car und Car monarchy in Austria. He didn't like this mixed race empire and with this Völkergemischens in Central Europe. He saw his future as being with Germany, who never wanted to fight in the Austrian army.
Meanwhile, Hitler's future adversary, Bernard Montgomery, lives in London, the capital of the world and the heart of the vast British Empire, where the sun never sets. It's the 3rd of June, 1914. Trooping the colour to honour the birthday of the British King George V. "26-year-old Bernard Montgomery, affectionately known as Monty, has just returned from the Indian colonies. Now he's leading the comfortable, if a little boring, life of a British officer. Engagements in high society, but hardly any real challenges.
It was almost like a club. And the idea was that if you behaved well and you would be promoted, and as long as you were a good administrator of the natives in the colonies, you would do very well, and you might end up your career as Sir Bernard Montgomery.
This is the fading glitz of the old feudal Europe. Most of its rulers are related. The British king is in Berlin, visiting his cousin, the German Emperor Wilhelm II. They've exchanged uniforms as a sign of their bond. The occasion is the wedding of the Emperor's daughter, Victoria. Wilhelm's other cousin, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas, has also come. For now, there are only gun salutes. The 28th of June 1914 is a wonderful summer's day. But the day's headlines are full of doom. The Austrian heir to the throne and his wife have been murdered. They're shot by Serbian nationalists during a visit to Sarajevo. This assassination is the spark that sets off the First World War. But hardly anyone is taking any notice.
It wasn't immediately thought of that this is now going to be, this is the start of a major conflagration in Europe. And the English politician, or a British politician rather, Lord George said later on that the European nations, I think the phrase was, slithered over the edge into the cauldron of war.
To be honest, the news of Franz Ferdinand's death didn't cause any deep feelings of sympathy.
Comments the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig. The people are enjoying the holidays at the Wannsee, just as at the Baltic Sea, the bathtub of Berlin. This is the summer in which Europe commits suicide. A children's party in Gaggenau in Swabia. How many of these small children will later fall victim to the Second World War? How many of these girls will become war widows? Horse racing at Ludwigslust. The ladies of Mecklenburg high society are showing off their finest wardrobe. And again, children playing up for the camera. Worry-free and full of mischief. But these are the last jovial hours of an entire era. Just like every summer, the German Kaiser also goes on holiday to Norway on his yacht Hohenzollern. Meanwhile, his politicians and generals are navigating straight into a catastrophe. But they're not alone.
For a very long time, historical research was concentrated on Germany when we discussed the outbreak of the First World War in summer 1914. We now, I think, have moved away from that concentration on Germany, and we know now that it was with the responsibility of all great powers, almost all great powers. All great powers contributed to the outbreak of the First World War, and we now know that in every capital of Europe, the general staffs, the prime ministers, the monarchs were playing with fire.
But the central powers of Germany and Austro-Hungary are the first to cross the red line. 4 weeks after the assassination in Sarajevo, Austria declares war on Serbia. As a result, Serbia's ally Russia begins to mobilize. To preempt an attack, Germany now declares war on Russia, and 2 days later also on the Russian ally France. The die has been cast.
They all thought this would be an easy war, quickly won, over within a very short time, and everything would go on, and there'd be a sort of cleansing effect through this war. There's a curious notion that this idea that war would have a cleansing effect on Europe.
Germany's declaration of war on Russia comes on the 1st of August 1914. It's a fateful day. The Emperor addresses his people.
The sword now has to decide. The enemy attacks us in the midst of peace. That's why we have to take up arms. Any wavering, any doubts would be treason against the fatherland.
A patriotic frenzy takes hold, here at the Odeonsplatz in Munich. Heinrich Hoffmann, the man to become Hitler's personal photographer in later years, photographs the crowds. Adolf Hitler is also there. This photograph apparently shows him. Whether real or photoshopped, one thing is certain. Hitler is filled with German nationalist excitement and volunteers. Later, he will claim that the Bavarian king personally gave him permission to become a Bavarian soldier, despite being an Austrian citizen. It's a propaganda lie.
It was chaotic at the time, the beginning of August 1914, and lots of people were rushing to join up and so on. Hitler was one of those, and he got into the German army by mistake, really.
These are the most arduous days of his life. He writes to his landlord in Munich. The times when he could sleep until midday, then paint a little before taking in a Wagner opera in the evening, are well and truly over. Hitler is assigned to the Royal Bavarian Infantry Reserves Regiment No. 16, the so-called Regiment List. He will later describe it as an elite regiment of fiery volunteers. This, too, is a propaganda lie.
Achtung!
The regiment is badly equipped. The men have no training. Many are already a little older, just as Hitler himself. The enlistment oath. For the first time, the outsider Hitler is part of something. His regiment parades in front of the Bavarian king. Soldiers on their way to the front.
I have witnessed quite a few jubilant crowds since then, but the enthusiasm was never as deep and overwhelming as on this day.
Writes the volunteer Ernst Junger. It's the same everywhere. In Vienna, finally, the chance to teach the cheeky Serbs a lesson. In Paris, to settle an old score with a sworn enemy Germany. tender farewells. Karl Zuckmayer later writes,
"We went to war like young lovers, and just like them, we had no idea what was to come."
most of the soldiers are certain they'll be back home by Christmas at the latest. And the German military strategists believe speed is their only chance of victory, because Germany is in a predicament.
The Germans always tried to prevent a war at two fronts. This was what Bismarck tried to prevent in the 1880s, then his successors in the 1890s. So for the Germans it was quite clear you can't win a war at two fronts in the West and the East. But then in 1914 this was exactly what happened. So you had Britain and France in the West, Russia in the East. So the strategic situation could not have been worse.
The aim is to first defeat France, then Russia. The German General Staff have a plan. A quick assault through neutral Belgium to deliver a devastating strike to the French army coming from the north. France is to be beaten within 42 days. The 4th of August, 1914. German troops invade Belgium. It's a breach of international laws. But they are met with a surprise. The Belgians put up a spirited resistance.
Die Deutschen haben nicht damit gerechnet, dass die Belgier...
The Germans didn't expect the Belgians to put up any resistance, not least because both politicians and military strategists had said that Belgium isn't the main target, and the Belgian army is a vanishing opposition. They called them chocolate box soldiers.
Oder Pralinensoldaten, wie man damals gesagt hat.
But Great Britain comes to the aid of the Belgians. On the 4th of August, it declares war on Germany. Up to that point, Germans and British have never been at war with one another. No British soldier has set foot on the West European mainland for 100 years. The British Expeditionary Corps includes the officer Bernard Montgomery.
The truth is, Monty was rather excited. After all, he'd had seen some combat on the northwest frontier of India with Afghans, but this was a very different kind of anticipation. But even he had no idea what was coming, no idea at all. They were still thinking in terms of cavalry. He had sharpened his sword as a lieutenant. And he imagined it almost in terms of Napoleonic warfare.
But this war will be completely different. Unlike any war gone before. A war without bounds. The machine guns kill in intervals of a second. It's an automated war. For the first time, war also comes from the air and takes place in the air. It's killing on an industrial scale, unimaginable until now. A conflagration.
The level of death and destruction, the use of the modern technology in the war was on a scale that had been unimaginable. And the experience of the soldiers then of these went bright and breezily into the war, very rapidly turned into this the abject horror.
Dying en masse begins gradually, and it begins in the most beautiful of summers. It starts with small skirmishes in Belgium. It's the 6th of August, 1914, near Liège. These are unique testimonials of this day. Old glass plates, found by accident on a flea market. These are the first fallen men, the first of millions. The priest in the village of Wartime had asked to have the dead of these first battles photographed to be able to identify them later.
You look death in the eye, it's the faces of war, and it is really what war does to people. War is a business of killing people, and that's the only business it is.
This is how the families want to remember their dead. Young and bursting with health. The reality of this war is very different.
Someone tried to give an image of the people killed and therefore almost of the act of killing. Just imagine if it had continued like that. We would end up now with 10 million identification images, pictures, photographs, portraits of death.
To die for your fatherland is sweet and honourable, they'd been told. They march up to 40 kilometres a day in sweltering heat. They don't drink the water in the wells for fear the Belgians may have poisoned it. On the other hand, no wine cellar is safe, and there are many of those in Belgium. Everywhere there are control posts. Wild rumours circulate. Apparently, Belgian civilians are ambushing and shooting Germans.
The fear was grounded in the fact that modern infantry weapons in 1914 had a range of 1,600 meters, sometimes a little more. So from that distance, it was completely impossible to tell who'd been shooting. Even from 1,000 meters, it's impossible to tell. Is he wearing a uniform or not?
Could Belgian windmills be hideouts for snipers, so-called francs-tireurs? Figments of the fertile imagination of inexperienced troops. On the 19th of August, German units arrive at the Belgian university town of Leuven. The inhabitants are to surrender all their weapons or face the death penalty. The imperial troops take their quarters. There's a curfew for locals after 8 p.m. On the evening of the 25th of August, tired, irritable men man a control post at the edge of Leuven. There are shots in the darkness. Are these Belgian snipers? The German soldiers fire into the windows. And they begin to burn down the proud townhouses of Leuven. They call it a criminal tribunal. Even the pride of the town, its medieval library, falls victim to the flames, including its 230,000 valuable books. The next morning, the heart of the city has been razed to the ground. On his way to the front, Private Hitler also comes through Leuven. He notes it as a heap of burnt rubble. He doesn't have eyes for the suffering of its inhabitants. But what triggered the nighttime shooting? It is now clear that it wasn't Belgian snipers. It's more likely that nervous German soldiers accidentally shot at each other. Friendly fire.
There are a number of proven cases where German soldiers demonstrably shot at each other. The soldiers know it and the officers write about it in their own private letters and private war diaries.
But But the citizens of Leuven are the ones who pay the price. Over 200 are executed, without substantiating proof or court proceedings. Men are taken to Germany as forced laborers. The tragedy of Leuven is a catastrophe, not least because of the damage it does to Germany's reputation abroad. Enemy propaganda exploits it shamelessly. They're now called the Huns, or Boche, pigs in French. The spiked helmets become a dark symbol.
In the old days, great powers waged war as somehow a bit as gentlemen. They regarded themselves as being equal. And in this understanding, the First World War was very different. So the great powers did not regard themselves as equal. The opponent was something very evil. It was something like fighting against the beast. You must win the war. You must defeat the enemy. There's no solution for that. And this is the reason, this perception, this power of perception is the reason why there was no peace in 1915, no peace in 1916. It was this striving for final victory, for final defeat of the enemy.
German counter-propaganda. Awkward attempts to paint the men in the spiked helmets as child-friendly gentlemen. Good people here, spare them, writes the soldier. In fact, excesses like in Leuven do stop after just a few weeks, but it's already too late. The Germans reach Brussels. By the end of August 1914, Belgium is beaten, and the Imperial Army is still on schedule. There is now only one natural obstacle separating the German army from Paris: the Marne River in northern France. They get closer and closer. For now, the Germans have the upper hand. Thousands of French soldiers are taken captive. By the end of August 1914, victory in the West seems to be virtually a done deal for the German Empire. At least that's the opinion of the German Supreme Army Command. It makes a fateful decision. 2 entire army divisions are removed from the fighting in France and loaded onto trains. They're heading towards the eastern border of the German Empire. The Russian Empire has mobilized its armies faster than expected. They've already entered eastern Prussia. The divisions from France are to help keep them at bay. But when they arrive, the decisive battle is already over. The Battle of Tannenberg. It's been a victory for the German Empire. 90,000 Russian soldiers are taken prisoner. Masses of materials are captured. The victor of Tannenberg is Paul von Hindenburg. He becomes a popular hero. The German refugees of eastern Prussia can return home.
Well, the Battle of Tannenberg was definitely a major German success, but you could ask the question, what was the strategic consequence of the victory of Tannenberg? And well, at this time of the year, in summer 1914, Germany have to win the campaign in France. So they must win in France, they must defeat France. So Tannenberg didn't change the strategic situation of Germany. In Tannenberg, the Germans did not defeat Russia. The war was going on the Eastern Front, and everybody was concentrated on the Western Front, waiting for a decisive victory there.
On the 3rd of September 1914, the first German forces crossed the Marne. Now it's just 18 kilometers to Paris. The French government has already left the city, but the will to offer resistance remains unbroken. French soldiers are even taking taxis to go north, towards the Marne River and the front. It's all or nothing for the Western powers now. With massive foot slogs, the British managed to catch up with the French forces. Bernard Montgomery writes to his mother,
"We have become toughened. We sleep outside in any weather. You get used to it. I haven't washed my face and my hands in 10 days.
The Battle of the Marne is to be decisive. The Western powers offer up everything they have. 1 million French and British soldiers against 750,000 Germans. But then something happens that the French call the miracle of the Marne. Following days of bloody battles, the Germans surprisingly pull back. But they have good reason to do so.
Die haben sich nicht plötzlich zurückgezogen.
They didn't suddenly retreat. They were suddenly and overwhelmingly outnumbered and faced the very real threat of a massive military defeat. There were big gaps between the attacking units, which the opposition forces could exploit.
They're now badly missed. Those 2 army divisions sent to Eastern Prussia by the German military leadership. But the really decisive thing is something else. The German forces have lost touch with each other. The supply chain isn't working properly. Eventually, there's an order from the Imperial Supreme Command in Luxembourg to retreat to positions that are more easily defendable. It's the first big German defeat in this war.
They couldn't have gone on. It would have been impossible. It would have been a catastrophe, and big parts of the army would probably have become encircled and destroyed.
The dream of a quick victory over France is over. The battle plan of the German Supreme Command has failed. How will they go on? They are at a loss. The people in Germany aren't told about this, except perhaps from soldiers on leave from the front, like here in Leipzig. War is still the boys' favorite game. The painter, August Macke, writes to his wife from the front. "When I think about the 2 little guys, I'm gripped by despair that I might not see them again." Soon afterwards, August Macke is killed. The mass killings are in full flow now.
Nach wenigen Wochen muss man
After a few weeks, they have to stop publishing the lists of the dead in newspapers because there are simply too many names. The families concerned are informed and they grieve, but I think that the first months of the war with these massive losses don't really register properly during the war.
während des Krieges nicht so wahrgenommen.
They still go to the front, anxious they might be too late to fight. In Flanders, the soldiers on both sides begin to dig themselves in. Trench warfare, barbed wire, communication trenches and fortifications. At times, the enemies are positioned only meters from one another. The men attempt to disappear in the ground, it's the only protection they have from artillery fire. The Germans become the undisputed masters of trench building. Life in the death zone, sometimes for years, sometimes only for a few days before a bloody end. By October 1914, the volunteers are also seeing action. The exuberant enthusiasm of the start of the war seems a lifetime ago. Private Hitler is also here. On the 29th of October, there's an order to attack British positions. It's the first bit of action for the regiment list. They don't have proper helmets, nor do they know how to use their new rifles. 3 out of 4 are killed. Hitler later writes that the war had been his university.
He learnt this absolute hardness, this ruthlessness, the lack of compassion, the lack of any sort of human feelings. The cause is crucial. Human beings are simply atoms that come and go, and from what little bit we know about his early life, Hitler didn't have a pronounced sense of human feelings or human warmth and so on. But in the First World War, this seems to have been knocked out of him completely.
After the war, Hitler stages himself as a frontline soldier. But he was only there for 4 days. Then he manages to find a comfortable place in the regiment's headquarters as a dispatch runner. He will glorify these years as the greatest time of his mortal life. For many of his comrades, he is now a base waller, one who no longer has to share the misery of the suckers at the front. And this misery is hard to imagine these days. It's the same on both sides of the front: cold, wet, and dirty, and constantly close to death. Of 110,000 British soldiers who went to war in August 1914, 90,000 are either dead or wounded just a few months later. In October 1914, there was also a grave ready and waiting for Bernard Montgomery. The Briton leads a company. He wants to take a German trench with his men and scouts the situation himself. He's shot through the lung. One of his men wants to save him and is mortally wounded himself. Stay behind! Nobody moves! In the night, his men want to recover the dead. They realize Montgomery is miraculously still alive. He's learned a lesson.
The shock was not only recognizing the reality of modern war, but the way it brought soldiers, officers, and the men together in this new kind of bond, really, in the trenches. And the more critical he became about the loss of human life, the more determined he became to try and preserve human life as far as possible by being a better professional.
For Bernard Montgomery, too, the First World War becomes a defining experience. But unlike Hitler, as a commanding officer later in life, he will always try to achieve his targets with the least number of casualties possible. The horror of trench warfare is too much for many to bear. In November 1914, the Saxon lieutenant Kurt Samisch notes in his diary,
"Every day we now get French soldiers coming over to us because they can no longer cope with life in the trenches."
The Western Front towards the end of 1914. A death zone several kilometers wide, running from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. Nothing is moving. By now, 1 million young men have senselessly lost their lives.
Well, in the end of 1914, the Germans had advanced a bit into France, but they conquered Belgium, advanced a bit into France. They were able to stop the offensive of the Russian offensive in the east. They were able to defeat at least some Russian troops, but there was no final victory for the Germans. And you could also say, well, even the Entente, the Allies, were not able to defeat Germany either. The astonishing thing is nobody had a master plan.
1 million young men are dead, killed in the space of just 5 months. The reality is 2 million grieving parents, just like the sculptress Käthe Kollwitz and her husband. Their son Peter is buried in the cemetery of Wladzło in Belgium. He was just 18 years old. That's how long Käthe Kollwitz worked on these sculptures. A scar that would never quite heal, and should never quite heal, she wrote. Berlin, 1914, just before Christmas. This is not how anyone would have imagined it. Where are all those fathers, all those brothers, who in August 1914 believed they would be back home by Christmas? So many of them will never come home. At no point in this war did as many soldiers die as in 1914. Christmas at the front. It means grub from the field kitchen rather than roast goose. Cold and near to death, instead of happy times with the loved ones gathered around a Christmas tree. Christmas Eve in Flanders. It's a starry night. The first in a long time, notes the Saxon lieutenant Kurt Samisch in his diary. He's ordered that not a single shot should be fired, if at all avoidable. In the British trench, it's the same story. Christmas Eve.
We communicate with each other, whistling and shouting.
Samisch writes. The British soldier Bruce Bairnsfather reports,
Following a little to and fro, the Germans put up lights, and so do we. Soon, the two front lines looked fit for a celebration.
Eventually, the first of them dare to venture out of their trenches. First steps into the death zone.
All this was wonderful and bizarre.
writes Kurt Samish.
Christmas, the festival of love, turned the hated foe into friends for a short time.
The British soldier Ernest Morley later reports,
"The Germans approached us, and we walked towards them. We had the very bizarre pleasure to chat with the men who had been doing their best to kill us, and we them.
We have proof of over 30 cases around here. And in some cases, it lasted for over 10 days into the new year. If the two units opposing each other and having a truce were staying there for quite a while, you notice that nobody is restarting the war again.
Pictures of a unique incident. Something like this will not be repeated in the coming years at war. It's a quiet revolt of humanity. As long as the officers of the troops at the front play ball. But eventually, the commanders crack down on them. There are signals for the men in the trench opposite. We have to shoot at you again now.
This slaughterhouse lasted for 4 long years and left a world behind it which was unrecognizable from that which had started the war in 1914. And the war which took place in 1939 to 1945 is unthinkable, really, without what happened in the First World War. That the disturbances that the First World War created, the social unrest, the economic mayhem that resulted from it, all this left unfinished business.
What would Europe look like today if those in power in 1914 had acted a little more wisely? As it is, it took another dreadful war before the people of Europe would learn to approach each other again. The war has been raging for 2 years. It will shape the lives of generations to come. Several million soldiers are fighting on the battlefields of Europe. By 1916, the German advance in the West has long ground to a halt. It's turned into bitter, static trench warfare. French and German soldiers face each other along a 700-kilometer front line, also at Verdun. The war swallows up huge numbers of people and masses of material. The Germans want to regain the advantage and plan an offensive at the Meuse River. The French know only too well what's at stake and take up their positions. But they're under observation from the air.
The war in the air in 1916 takes a dramatically different turn, a turn that begins at Verdun right at the start of the year, because that is the moment when the German Air Force takes the decision to concentrate fighters into squadrons. And by doing that, to create areas of airspace which they are in control of for that period of time while the aircraft are in the air, which is part of the reason why the Germans can prepare the Verdun offensive in so much secrecy.
Herman Goering is a member of the new German Air Force. He's a young lieutenant with a crucial assignment: to recce the military situation at Verdun from the air. Hundreds of pictures are taken using special cameras. They are to give an indication of the enemy force's size and its positions. Goering knows all about war on the ground. He was injured in 1914 and deemed no longer fit for infantry service. Now he wants to find glory another way, as a reconnaissance pilot. A mansion house near Épinay, a safe distance from the front. Armed with his photographs, the young pilot gains access to the highest military circles. The Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, commands the local attacking forces. Chief of Staff von Falkenhayn bears the overall responsibility. Goering's pictures surprise the military leadership. They now believe they know where the opponent's weak spot lies. It's good news for the messenger.
Verdun had a positive or lasting effect for him because, through his first assignment at the time, he'd caught the Crown Prince's eye, who was the commander-in-chief there. He doesn't just decorate him, he also mentions him in his memoirs by name.
The Battle of Verdun has been raging since the 21st of February 1916. Thousands of artillery pieces pound the fortifications outside the town to clear the way for the advancing infantry. There's never been so much artillery in action in such a small space. It's exceptionally destructive.
This feeling of wanting to break through and force a decision remained a basic aspiration right until the end and continued to refresh fighting courage.
The war is different from any others before it. Massive armies face each other. There are just a few professional soldiers next to millions of young men from all walks of life, all lacking serious military experience. Technological progress now shows its cruel face. The area between the opposing trenches is called the death zone. Symbolic of the Battle of Verdun will be its fortresses. Fort Douaumont is the biggest one. After just a few days, the Germans managed to conquer it without difficulty. It was the most important and the most modern fortress in the defensive buffer zone in front of Verdun. The taking of the fortress by the Germans is a shock for the French, including a young captain wounded in the battle. He's taken to a German field hospital to be treated for his injury. As a French officer, Charles de Gaulle is treated in a way befitting his rank. He feels humiliated by the way this battle has ended for him.
De Gaulle, c'est vraiment un militaire. Il avait choisi ce métier.
De Gaulle was a real military man. He chose this line of work and was very ambitious. During the war, it's obvious he was intent on climbing the career ladder. The fact that he was taken captive was a serious blow to his morale.
Many others share the same fate along this stretch of the front. At Verdun alone, thousands of prisoners are taken on both sides. Nobody is prepared for the sheer numbers.
In the First World War, prisoners of war en masse are a first. Suddenly, there are 100,000 captives. what could be done with all these people? There is no precedent. So they have to compromise. I have to say, despite all the cruelties that did take place, there is a substantial difference between the treatment of prisoners of war in World War I and World War II.
For the most part, the prisoners are treated in accordance with the laws of war. But the supply of their provisions is problematic. Another mass phenomenon in this war. The number of wounded and maimed reaches hundreds of thousands. Modern technology is now needed to put right what it has wreaked on the battlefields. Films are to show and reassure that the victims are well cared for.
It is true that this side of the war was made public. It wasn't hidden away. At times, the advertisement of prosthetics in German specialist journals and in the public newspapers goes so far that, to be sarcastic, one might be feeling a little jealous of the people who don't have a silly arm anymore, but instead a fabulous gripping tool, who can screw a hammer or pliers straight onto the prosthetic rather than having to cope with a cumbersome hand.
They go to some lengths to make those maimed and crippled feel useful by contributing to the war effort from home.
They're doing well, don't worry. That's how people manage to cope with this appalling experience.
Initially, these pictures are kept from the public.
The French call this the gueule cassée, and the association of, in English, broken faces is still very powerful in France, even today.
The battle for Verdun alone will destroy many lives. German artillery reaches as far as the town square. Thousands flee their homes. Scenes that will become commonplace during the two world wars. The French fear the Germans could make a breakthrough here and reach Paris within just a few weeks. They're looking for someone to solve their problems at Verdun. Henri-Philippe Pétain, an experienced general, takes charge. His orders are to hold Verdun at all costs. For the flag, for victory, a French propaganda poster. Virtually every French soldier will fight at Verdun at some point during the war. The people in France's capital have by now lived with the German threat for 2 years. Apparent normality, in which women set the tone. Millions of men are away fighting at the front, yet the needs of their families at home are well catered for. The people of France don't go hungry, not even in the years of war to follow.
For civilians far removed from the front, daily routines become homogeneous. They continue with their normal activities, but that's deceptive. Even if you're in Marseille, you still have a father, a brother, or a son serving at the front. If you work in the fields, you're in a way feeding the war. If you're working in a factory, you're more than likely also working for the war. This apparent normality can be very misleading. The war is not physically here, but it's unlikely anybody can escape the war in these times.
In Germany, they are queuing for bread, butter, meat, and vegetables. Many provisions go straight to the military. You even need ration coupons for new clothes. The people have lost faith in a quick end to the war. How do they cope?
This war is the new life. This is how our lives are going to be. We'll actually be all much more comfortable if we just accept that we're now a country at war and we have no prospect of it ever ending. And that way, we'll stop worrying. We'll stop having to calculate. We'll become resigned to our fates. We'll become institutionalized, really, as war-making nations. And I think the longer that goes on, the more that mood takes place and hope becomes extinguished.
The main cause of the plight in Germany is the British naval blockade. As early as 1914, the North Sea is declared a war zone. Only once does the Emperor's navy make an attempt to challenge the British fleet. At the end of May 1916, there is a single huge battle between the two naval powers at Skagerrak off Norway. The Battle of Jutland. The British far outnumber the Germans. It's 150 ships against 100. In the end, neither are victorious, but there are many casualties. Over 6,000 dead on the side of the British, and more than 2,500 on the German side. The Germans sink twice as many ships, but the blockade remains in place. In the face of British superiority, any further attempts to break through seem pointless. This is a time of waiting for many sailors. At the end of the war, they will refuse a combat mission ordered by the Kaiser and rebel. The war is also proving to be a logistical nightmare behind the front line. Supplies of people, weapons, and ammunition are deciding factors over winners and losers.
The logistical effort required to put this offensive in place is enormous, because what you're effectively having to do is to create roads where there are no roads, railways where there are no railways, and put in a system of telegraph communication which isn't in place necessarily either.
The front isn't just a system of trenches and fortifications. The facilities needed to cater for the troops reach far into the hinterland. There are field kitchens, bakeries, stables and transport fleets, ammunition depots and weapons arsenals. First aid stations are about 3 kilometers from the front, field hospitals about 20 kilometers. On the German side, trains lead almost to the front line, because every day they have to look after an army with enough soldiers to populate a major city. Every battalion is like a mirror image of society and all its professions. On the French side, everyday life behind the front line is also being documented. Alcohol is distributed to still the soldiers' fear of the next assault. This war eats up more resources than any before it. It requires supplies on a sheer, unimaginable scale. An enormous industrial undertaking involving many thousands of soldiers on both sides who eat, sleep, and fight here.
The Battle of Verdun was so special because it was fought on a very small area. It was not the costliest battle of the First World War, but it was the battle fought on the smallest area. And in this very small, tiny area around Verdun, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and this small area around Verdun saw the first battle of attrition of the First World War.
hundreds of thousands of grenades are ready to literally plow up just a few square kilometers of ground. They turn the battlefield into a living hell.
Modern warfare is no longer a man-to-man fight. The enemy is everywhere. Its deadly ammunition rains from the sky. Modern weapons turn once honorable combat into a senseless slaughter.
The French company commander Jacques Delvert comments in his diary,
"This battle has been raging for 100 days already. The trench warfare is wearing my men down. We should end this war as soon as possible."
A young Frenchman writes in his letter from the front,
15 days in Verdun have drained and demoralized us more than 6 months in the trenches before.
Millions of letters from the front reach the families at home. But increasingly, they bring news of deaths. Of dying or battle wounds and maimings, of farewells and last hope. There is no safe place on the battlefields. Death now also comes from the air. Reconnaissance flights turn into fighter planes, which develop into bombers. Cameras are exchanged for machine guns and explosives. In March 1916, Herman Goering celebrates his first downing of a French bomber. But contrary to the battles on the ground, this is still an apparently gallant war.
They're looking for duels, in a way almost like a step back to the Middle Ages, where you would also try to compete with each other during a personal dispute. That's the difference to the soldiers in the trenches.
Harbingers of a war that only decades later will obliterate entire cities. The War of the Bombers. For now, these are still isolated attacks, involving just a few hundred aircraft. For now, it's mainly airships that push far into enemy airspace, all the way to Freiburg, Cologne, Paris, London. These are terror attacks designed to spread fear amongst the population. The material damage is minor, but it is a testbed for the future. In World War II, Flight Lieutenant Goering will be commander of Hitler's Luftwaffe. He'll order the merciless bombing of civilian centers. But the First World War is fought on the ground. The battle for Verdun reaches a crucial stage. There is a grueling jostling for position around Fort Vaux. The German soldiers know what is expected of them. On the 1st of June 1916, a senior lieutenant of the 50th Infantry Division notes,
"The great day has arrived. We are going to attack Fort Vaux. Just before the attack, all doubts disappear and our duty to our holy fatherland wins out."
If you compare less than 30 years later, what happens at Stalingrad, for example, that battle is the same genus, if you like. The big difference is it's taking place in a city, which I think is one of the big contrasts between the First and the Second World Wars, is that cities become battlegrounds because people realize the defensive capabilities of a city, even in a semi-destroyed or totally destroyed state. But the weapon systems that are being used in the Second World War are weapon systems that, broadly speaking, reached their maturity in the First World War and are being fought by armies of comparable size and scale.
Chemical weapons are used only in the First World War. Their effects are horrendous and too unpredictable. At first, mainly irritant and disabling chemicals are used, but later also lethal substances begin to appear. Special units are formed and artillery grenades filled with the substances. The soldiers die agonizing deaths. Survivors suffer from terrible chemical burns. The threat of chemical warfare spreads fear amongst the people of Verdun. They fashion makeshift masks from wet cloth. But these children wouldn't have survived a serious attack. Gas is also used during the battle for Fort Vaux. The Germans advance with flamethrowers, meter by meter. Shortly before the surrender, the fortress's French commander notes,
"All communications with the outside world have collapsed. The battle for the fortress is dreadful. The suffering of the wounded is horrendous. We are defeated through exhaustion and thirst."
The survivors of Fort Vaux are taken into German captivity. Altogether, about 8 million soldiers will be taken prisoner in this war. The Hague Convention of 1907 forms the basis of their treatment. It decrees prisoners should be treated with humanity, and with regards to food, quarters, and clothes, there should be no distinction from one's own troops. But faced with huge numbers of prisoners, the military powers are often unable to cope. During the first winter, there are mass deaths in several countries. There are 2.5 million inmates from 13 different countries in German camps alone. Among them, Charles de Gaulle.
Pour un homme comme lui, être dans un camp de prisonniers.
For a man like him, it's intolerable to be sitting in a POW camp while others are dying at the front. He had only one wish, to return to the front. And to do that, he had to escape. He made several attempts. It was unbearable for him to be in the hands of the enemy.
But instead, his daily routine consists of reading the newspapers. He keeps his comrades informed, even gives talks. He would have been granted day passes in exchange for the promise not to make a run for it.
Could de Gaulle have gone for walks? Yes, outside the fortress. He didn't, because he refused to give such a promise on principle. In his view, a French officer has the duty to try to escape always, immediately, and at any time. That's why he'll never promise not to escape, even just temporarily.
In contrast to captured officers, ordinary soldiers are put to work. Most of them as agricultural laborers. For security reasons, operations essential to the war effort are excluded from the force's labor.
all powers use their prisoners of war that they're allowed to use as labor. Are they significant? Nothing like to the same extent as in the Second World War. It's not in the same deliberate exploitation of this manpower as a resource in the way in which you get in the Second World War. On the other hand, it happens. I mean, this is the beginning of a process.
Some prisoners are released early, especially the wounded and the sick. These are exchanged German soldiers on their way back home. For the most part, the German hinterland remains untouched by the ravages of war, unlike later during the Second World War. But behind the facades, the living conditions change significantly. Many are missing even the bare necessities. Food becomes scarce. Even soldiers on home leave complain. For example, that soldiers have to produce bread, meat, and potato ration cards in restaurants. Near Berlin, there's a reconstruction of life at the front, an attraction for day trippers.
I still find the trenches constructed in Grunewalds just fascinating. The people of Berlin were invited to come and have a look at how the soldiers at the front lived. These trenches were nice and clean. Nothing at all happened, just like a museum. And the people looked and said, "Oh, there are 3 tiers of trenches, so they are all safely hidden away."
While millions of men live through the reality of the front, their wives at home take on more and more of their jobs. In public service, in factories, in agriculture, administration, or at the workbenches of the armaments industry. But they get a third less pay. Mothers with children in particular depend on the additional income because the support for soldiers' families is meager. A Berlin woman writes to her husband at the front.
There's the worry of feeding the children. I'm exhausted. I've had to wait in line for 3 hours to get gas and 1.5 hours at the slaughterhouse on Tuesday. On top of that, there's the washing. When you come, you'll be able to see for yourself how we women are exploited.
In all countries, keeping the wartime economy going is now down to the women. In England, 2 million women take up jobs previously held by men. In France, every 5th woman goes out to work. It's also women who look after the destitute and veterans. Pictures from Great Britain show how they attempt to entertain those convalescing, sometimes with weird competitions.
There is often a strong contrast made between the experiences of the soldier at the front and a civilian world which knows nothing of what the war is about, and which lives in a sort of fantasy world, still going to the theatre, still going to restaurants, still relaxing, behaving as though there isn't a war on.
But those who have recovered enough are expected to return to the front.
Most of those in uniform are citizens in uniform. They're temporary soldiers. They're not career soldiers. These are people who are going to return from the war and take up their previous occupations, whether they were peasants or factory workers or clerks or lawyers. They're going to go back to doing those sorts of things.
In early summer 1916, the British mobilise hundreds of thousands of soldiers for an offensive in support of the French. At the Somme, a river basin 250 kilometers to the north of the battles raging around Verdun. The German occupiers have had more than a year to dig themselves in and fortify their positions here. It's the calm before the storm. These reconstructed scenes are to show life in the trenches during lulls in the fighting. By June 1916, there are 20 British and 11 French divisions stationed at the Somme. They're facing only half their number on the German side. In the end, almost 2.5 million soldiers will be fighting here. This is the first battle to be documented extensively on film. British camera teams follow the troops on their way to the front. Before the British infantry launches their attacks, artillery clears the way with a barrage lasting several days. They try to comfort and encourage the soldiers. This attack is to be different from earlier ones. The British Commander-in-Chief, Douglas Haig, says,
"The infantrymen simply have to walk over and occupy the German trenches."
1,500 artillery pieces will concentrate all their firepower on just a narrow strip of the German line. The barrage begins on the 24th of June 1916. In just 7 days and nights, around 1.5 million grenades detonate here. The author, Ernst Junger, later writes,
"There was artillery fire of unimaginable power that thundered and roared ahead of us. 1,000 flashes enveloped the western horizon like a sea of flames. There was a constant stream of the wounded returning with bloodless, sunken faces."
Quand on est bombardé, on est totalement impuissant. L'expérience du bombardement, c'est une expérience extrêmement traumatique.
When you're being bombarded, you're completely helpless. The experience is extremely traumatizing. Why? Because you could die at any moment, and you witness the deaths of your comrades all around you. So the bombardments cause trauma in the survivors, who ask themselves, why them? Why not me?
Pourquoi le voisin plutôt que moi?
There are some mysterious new clinical symptoms. They're called shell shock sufferers. Initially, they're thought to be simulating their condition.
The war physicians decided they were simply particularly shrewd shirkers and treated these people with horrendous forced methods, tied down electroshocks they didn't know.
On the 1st of July 1916, the British infantry at the Somme attacks the German lines. They believe the enemy positions to have been obliterated by the fierce artillery bombardment. But it's a fallacy. It takes just a few machine gunners and cannons to kill 8,000 British soldiers in just half an hour.
They can't retreat either, because the guards in the trenches would shoot them immediately. Soldiers know this. There's no return for them.
This kind of battle police of the British Army also exists on the German side. There are reasons why the Germans survived the bombardment at the Somme. The strong fortifications were several meters deep and generally withstood the shelling. But above ground, there was an inferno. The Battle of the Somme is one of the most gruesome examples of how military commanders clung to outdated ways of fighting. Again and again, the British General Haig orders his troops to attack the German positions.
If you lose nearly 20,000 dead and nearly 40,000 wounded in a single day, of course, the experience of the Somme was traumatic. The effects were traumatic in certain battalions, and they were felt throughout those effects throughout British society because those battalions were very often so-called PALS battalions that had been locally recruited, and very often whole platoons, sections had come from the same streets in the same cities.
With over 1 million dead, wounded and missing on both sides, this is the most costly battle of the First World War.
The Battle of the Somme is really the iconic moment for Britain in terms of its understanding of its own military history in the 20th century. It's the example to avoid. It's what every British general in the Second World War has not to do. And it's also a definition of what can happen if you have a continental outlook on war. This is what European war can be like if you misinterpret it and get it wrong. So it has a very profound long-term effect.
German field hospitals are overflowing with thousands of wounded, including the dispatch runner Hitler, who was hit by a piece of shrapnel in October 1916. He's taken to Belitz, near Berlin, to convalesce. He's bitterly disappointed.
Hitler said the regiment was his home, and he never felt anywhere as much at home as he did in the regiment. Here he had some sort of community and he wanted to get back to it.
Hitler will later refer to the Belitz Sanitarium as a wondrous place. He writes about his time there in his pamphlet, Mein Kampf.
The spirit of the army at the front is no longer welcome here. Agitators without any conscience were in charge and tried to ridicule the notions of the decent soldier with all means of their pathetic oratory.
He hasn't been back to Germany since 1914. He uses his stay at the hospital to visit the capital. His experiences there disgust him.
And he hated what he saw, the defeatism and the shirking and the malingering that he saw when he went to Berlin.
The initial enthusiasm for the war has long turned into bitter disillusionment here. His comrades regard him as a loner, and Hitler detects defeatism, cowardice, and treason everywhere. The atmosphere amongst the population is becoming more and more strained. There are protests, and there is widespread hardship.
I often don't know whether I'm coming or going. You're supposed to cook, everyone is hungry, and you have nothing to give them.
An Augsburg woman writes. More and more children are malnourished. Many die. The government is facing heavy criticism. The emperor tries to appease with symbolic gestures.
If we stand today in front of the German parliament in Berlin, we see the inscription Dem deutschen Volke, for the German people. And this inscription was made in the end of 1916 to offer the starving German people and suffering German people something. I mean, the German people had no political power. There was no real democracy at this time. They were starving. It was quite a bad situation of the German people, and there was also no hope to gaining political power. So this inscription was so a symbol from the authorities to offer at least a hope to the German people that they might get in the future more political power.
For 2 long years, the German Reich has been leading a war on 2 fronts. In the east, the battle zones are more open and spacious. Russia has to relinquish control of large tracts of land. The war here is still on the move. It's not ground to a halt in the trenches. The opponents are trying to encircle one another in pincer movements. The Tsar's army is suffering from supply breakdowns, shortages of ammunition and food. It demoralizes his soldiers. But in the summer of 1916, a wave of attacks closely coordinated with the Western Allies is designed to put pressure on Germany and its associate, Austro-Hungary. One of the Russian generals, Alexei Brusilov, no longer sends his soldiers unprotected into the line of German machine gun fire. He now prepares his attacks carefully with artillery barrages. The German High Command reacts by withdrawing around 100,000 soldiers from the Western Front. They are transferred to the east.
The Brusilov offensive is absolutely the Eastern Front's contribution to the overall Allied strategy of convergent attacks on all fronts simultaneously to pull the Germans in three directions at once. So the Brusilov offensive fulfills its role. And in fact, it's the Brusilov offensive that really provides the relief for the French at Verdun.
In the east, too, hundreds of thousands of soldiers are taken prisoner. In 1916, some of the captive Germans are taken to Moscow and St. Petersburg to parade them in front of the public. For the Russian propaganda, it's a welcome way of diverting attention from the weaknesses of their own army. Over 100,000 German soldiers are deported to Siberia. Every fifth man won't return. The war in the East is different from the West.
Parts of it are very bloody. It's a slaughter, not the least because the civilian population is more involved.
Not only the Russian soldiers have to go hungry, but their families, the entire population suffers. Resentment grows, while the nobility and the Tsar's family still live lives of luxury. The war deepens the chasm between the ruler and his people. It's the first stirring of the Russian Revolution that will topple the Tsar's regime in the coming year. His opponent, Kaiser Wilhelm II, also refuses to relinquish power to the people. He didn't want these terrible losses, he says. He distributes medals. Herman Goering, too, receives the highest decoration from the Kaiser. His plane crashed during an aerial dogfight. But following his recovery, he still wants to prove himself. As a fighter pilot, Goering will down more than 20 enemy aircraft by the end of the war. Even after the war, a flying ace can count himself as a hero. But like so many who cling on to the illusion of victory, he will find the eventual defeat humiliating and follow a demagogue called Hitler. Charles de Gaulle will become Hitler's opponent in the future, but remains in German captivity until the end of the war. He tries to escape 5 times, because that's what a French officer is supposed to do. He's certain that in the end, the Germans will lose. He learns to understand and speak their language. Charles de Gaulle has been thinking about the murderous trench warfare and its senselessness. Never again should a war be led as rigidly and with as many casualties as this one. This attack is supposed to change the course of the Second World War. At the end of 1944, 18 German divisions go on the offensive in the Ardennes. They're led by Army Group Commander Walter Model. His assignment? To return the advantage to Hitler's Wehrmacht, despite its desperate situation. He's even brought troops from the Eastern Front specifically for this purpose. The element of surprise is a success, at least initially. The US Army has been on the advance ever since setting foot in France. Now, for the first time, it's on its back foot. An experienced general and his troops comes to their aid from the south, George Smith Patton. He's a passionate and experienced tank division commander. He'd had his baptism of fire 26 years earlier, during the First World War. Just like his opponent, Walter Model, here during a visit to Hitler's headquarters. He's also a long-serving professional soldier. Model had once before been part of a military initiative against the West in an equally difficult deadlock. At that time, in March 1918, he was a General Staff Officer with the German Supreme Army Command.
And if your plan fails, Ludendorff?
Then Germany will have to perish.
The 27-year-old captain looks up to his superiors Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff.
Gentlemen, we have to.
At their headquarters in the Belgian resort of Spa, the army commanders plan a massive offensive for the 21st of March, 1918. It's to bring a turnabout in this fifth year of war. Its codename, Operation Michael. Hindenburg and Ludendorff appear to find it impossible to think of reaching an armistice without a German victory. Since the German invasion in 1914, the war has ground to a halt to the east of Paris. 1 million soldiers on each side, Germans in the east and French and British in the west, have been fighting each other since then, but the front line has stayed put. In a massive war of attrition, the land between the rivers Somme and Marne has literally been ploughed up. Even today, the ground bears the scars of bombs and grenades. By the beginning of 1918, over 1.5 million men have met their end in the War of the Trenches. Now the frontline soldiers put all their hopes in this expected decisive battle. A German lieutenant later remembers,
"We're about to make history," they told us. We were convinced that the attack ahead was in the end going to bring the war to a victorious close.
The ordinary German soldier always tried to make sense of the war, because it was quite a disastrous situation in the trenches, without food, the danger of being killed and so on and so on. This for years, no end in sight. So they tried to make sense. And in spring 1918, there was the big hope with a last offensive, a final offensive. They might win the war, and then there's peace. So a situation in spring 1918 was that they said, well, let's stay together, let's have one last effort, one last chance to end this endless war.
General Staff Officer Walter Model also believes in the victory. He had fought at the front himself, but near Verdun, his leg was badly wounded. Yet he remains filled with the ambition to contribute to the success of the war effort. Even in the German Reich, the spring of 1918 brings new hope. More than anything, it is fueled by a longing for an end to this war. It has forced austerity on the people in the German Empire more than at any other time in modern history. Over 13 million men are in military service. The women are left to master daily life at home and produce ammunition.
During the war, the state developed new powers over the civilian populations, powers of mobilization, powers of organization, economic controls, and so on. And the idea of this being a total war, a total effort, then emerged out of the First World War.
But the collective exertion also provokes a sense of war weariness and dissent. At the start of the year, hundreds of thousands go on strike. It's a protest against misery, diseases, and hunger, all of which have struck the civilian population hard during this war. Further east, widespread discontent in the Russian Empire has led to a revolution which topples the Tsar's reign in 1917. A communist dictatorship under Lenin's leadership has taken its place. Just beforehand, the Germans secretly smuggled him back into his homeland from exile. As expected, the new regime responds by putting an end to the war. On the Eastern Front, yesterday's enemies become allies. In Brest-Litovsk, in western Russia, the Central Powers demand tough conditions for a peace treaty. It frees the German Reich from the grip of a two-front war, 2 weeks before the planned attack in the West. It also frees up 200,000 fresh soldiers, as Private Dominic Richert remembers.
Train after train rolled towards the west, filled with soldiers and war materials. They thought the armies freed up in Russia would break through the English-French front line and gain victory despite everything.
Behind all of this was the thought on the German side that they had to force the collapse of the French and British armies before the Americans could reach the front with all their might. In this sense, the whole thing was, of course, an act of desperation.
The American government resorts to drastic measures to recruit for the deployment overseas. The US Army grows from 100,000 recruits to 4 million in the space of a single year, all under the banner of fighting for a free new world order. Half of them soon arrive in France's ports. What they lack in battle experience is compensated by good supplies and fresh fighting spirit.
The American Expeditionary Force suffers, as the British Expeditionary Force suffered in 1914, from going from a very low base point, from being a very small army to creating a mass army for continental war in a very short space of time. Now, what that means is you can bring manpower in very quickly. You can bring in untrained manpower very quickly. Can you produce a trained and effective army? That is why the British in particular say we need to brigade American units with British units.
From the very beginning, the Americans back a new generation of weapons that will shape future wars. Tanks. Preferably French models made by Renault with off-road capabilities. One young US officer has already realized that these are the future. George S. Patton is a pioneer of the new tank division and will later become a 4-star general in World War II. Just like his German counterpart, Walter Model, the ambitious captain sees his military service as a chance to get right to the top in the army. He's been drilling new recruits since the start of the year, simulating battles and training the steel battle aids. His motto?
2 men in a tank can offset 10 in front of it.
It
was a war of machines, the first great war of machines in history. And the situation of men versus machines really arose. That was really a new thing. Even just the massive amounts of artillery clustered together. That had never happened before. The first tanks were deployed, and the machine gun could substitute an entire company of infantry. Airplanes of all kinds, Zeppelins, and U-boats in the war at sea. All this led to the fact that this war turned into a gigantic battle of materials and weapons.
Like the sinking of the Austrian battleship St. Isvan in 1918. Almost 90 people lost their lives. 1,160,000 grenades are set aside in German depots, earmarked just for the initial phase of the planned battle. Walter Model has been transferred to a frontline division, tasked with a decisive contribution to the attack. His assignment: to ensure a reliable supply chain. But despite the amount of material available, he can already see that the supplies will only last if they manage to make a rapid breakthrough. The planned offensive in the west is also a race against time. On the German side, the anxiety of the forthcoming attack is mixed with a little cautious hope. Anything seems better than spending any more time in the trenches. A German soldier writes home,
"Dying by the bullet doesn't seem hard. But to be torn apart, hacked to pieces and pulped is a fear that the flesh cannot cope with."
The stalemate of trench warfare is the failure of all the military strategy up to that day. And they have no answer to that. And so they just keep on doing whatever they think is best. And the political leaders don't have the courage nor the alternative to stop it.
What are we sacrificing ourselves for?
A French artilleryman writes,
"If they could at least tell us that and not fob us off with speeches. From our perspective, we will not gain victory over the Germans, and it's the same the other way round."
Further north, positions are held by soldiers from right across the British Empire.
The mood on the Allied side of the line is pretty depressed, pretty low, particularly from the British point of view. The British Army has no real sense of imminent victory. In fact, if anything, the reverse. The expectation is, can they hold? Particularly when they don't know where the Michael offensive will be launched, which sector of the front. And of course, in the early part of the year, the Germans themselves haven't decided where it will be.
In the attackers' trenches, hardly anyone manages to get any sleep in the hours before the order to attack. Sergeant Max Schultz reports,
"The commander gave a speech. We were to participate in a great attack. It would be the last decisive battle. We trusted our generals and believed what he said. I thought of my parents and prayed that God would guide me through this thing in one piece."
On the 21st of March, at 4:40 a.m., the German barrage begins. 6,600 artillery pieces and 3,500 mortars reverberate along 70 kilometers of front line, with resounding success. A British captain describes one of his subordinates.
Achilles left a youth and returned an old man. He never recovered from this shock. On the 21st of March, he became a human wreck and could no longer be used as a soldier.
On the morning of the 21st of March 1918, the German attack started. The German artillery barrage on the British lines, on the French lines, and then the German stormtroopers attacked. And very much to the German surprise, the German stormtroopers suffered very, very heavy casualties. The British artillery was firing back, and it was, I think, one of the costliest days in the First World War for the German side. So thousands of German soldiers getting killed, mainly by artillery. And artillery was the deadliest weapon in the First World War. 56% of German soldiers died due to artillery. And it was also, a new impact on the soldier, something which was then up to then unknown. It was then given the name of a shell shock.
A British private describes the effects.
Nobody can cope with a barrage for more than 3 hours without being completely worn down and deadened to it. It's a little like paralyzation. After that, when the enemy come over, they can do anything to you. I think we were sacrificed.
Dominic Richert is among the attackers.
Everyone got ready with a pounding heart. We left the protection of the hole. Everywhere was brimming with German soldiers pushing forwards.
This is the first war fought in front of cameras, but they usually show a reenacted reality. In a few places, the attackers managed to push 5 kilometers further west. The price is unbelievably high. More than 17,500 British and German soldiers die in a single day. The German Supreme Command celebrates the start of the Kaiser Battle, as it is now called. Kaiser Wilhelm II awards the highest Prussian military decoration to his strategist Ludendorff. And the newly decorated general proclaims victory after just 4 days. In his enthusiasm, the Kaiser grants his youngest subjects a day off school. The hope of a speedy victory gains ground in the German Reich.
The spirit of those early days in August 1914 is coming back.
reports a witness of the time in Heidelberg. A corporal writes home,
"The daily pushes forward are encouraging and invigorating for the soldiers' disposition, which had dried up in the overly long trench warfare."
The Germans push westwards for up to 60 kilometers. They stretch the front, but they don't break through it. At least they've managed to fight their way out of their frozen positions, further than ever since 1914. "90,000 Allied soldiers are taken prisoner. The French capital is now within reach of German artillery and bombers. Its inhabitants worry about the protective shield in front of the city gates, which is threatening to turn into the front line.
For civilians in a number of countries, this was the first time really that the war had been felt by the population. The population had now been mobilized for war in a way that had never been done before. And ordinary people were aware now of the war, not just in the fact that their fathers or brothers were away at the front, but also the impact it was having on their ordinary lives. Women being conscripted for civilian work, driving buses or trams and things, working in munitions factories. All these sorts of things meant that the war now became a civilian war.
Women and children leave Paris, not least because of the dire supply situation. While the German attackers indulge in the bounty of newly conquered food depots. But anyone celebrating now is celebrating too soon.
So the Germans attacked in March 1918, and they punched a hole through the British lines, and they advanced. They pushed the British and the French soldiers back, but there was no final victory. So, and this was the problem of the whole offensive. The whole idea was a last battle, a last attack, and then the final victory. But this never happened.
At the beginning of April, the momentum of the attack slows down. The massive military entourage can't keep up. The army lacks the supplies to secure their advances. By comparison, their opponents are better equipped. Especially the US Army is constantly expanding its stocks of people and machines. But building up a tank division takes time, to the annoyance of the ambitious captain, George Patton, who notes in his diary,
"At times, I deeply regret that I didn't offer to join the infantry rather than the tank division. I wake up at night, bathed in sweat, fearful the war will be over before our new weapon is deployed."
But the battle isn't won yet. With support from the air, the German army undertakes 4 further offensives at other sections of the front line in early summer. They want to force a decision. The fighting rages to excess in all elements. According to Dominic Richert,
up in the air, there are a number of fierce dogfights which end in 2 planes crashing to the ground in flames. These pilots die a 3-fold hero's death. First they are shot dead, then they burn, and at the end they even smash to pieces on the ground.
this man tots up the greatest number of aerial victories on the German side. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. The propaganda proclaims him as a model knight of the skies. He takes to the air for the last time on the 21st of April 1918. Hit from the ground, Richthofen crash lands. British officers bury him with military honours, but his death seems like a bad omen. The attackers are now forced into defensive positions. On the 18th of July, the Allies launch a counter-strike. With British and American help, 13 French divisions push the Germans back towards the east. The Germans suffer the worst losses on the 8th of August. It's called the Black Day of the German Army. As a result, there are the first signs of disintegration. The number of prisoners increases dramatically. Dominic Richert describes the atmosphere.
If we could only put this mess behind us, was the universal wish. I only had one thought: to be captured. At least then your life would be safe.
The German soldiers in spring 1918 agreed it's worthwhile to have a last offensive. It makes sense to have a last offensive, a last battle. We must stand together to achieve the final victory. So let's come on, final battle. But then they saw they suffered so many casualties and they were not able to make it. Britain was not going to surrender, France was not going to surrender, and they saw, I mean, we tried everything, it's pointless. It's absolutely pointless, we can't make it. The war is lost.
A French officer describes the prisoners.
They don't talk at all. They are so weak, they don't even complain anymore. There is an immense sense of deep pain in their eyes.
But in the splendid surroundings of the German headquarters and the Belgian resort of Spa, the reality of life at the front seems to be largely ignored. The incredible suffering caused by the war seems far removed. The imperial chief strategists, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, continue their campaign unperturbed as if there had been no setbacks. They continue to produce new battle plans, which are passed on to the fighting troops. As General Staff Officer of a frontline division responsible for supplies and logistics, Walter Model has first-hand experience of the situation in the field. His conclusion: any victories, even those built on massive sacrifices and losses, are worth nothing if the supply chain can't keep up.
Go, boy, go! Hurry up!
The failed offensives take their toll on the ambitious young officer, but he retains his hope for ultimate victory. To the west of the front, the influx of new forces continues. The Germans ignored the facts for a long time, but it's now unmistakable. The US Army is rapidly becoming a significant opposition force.
Had the US not become involved in this war, the end would have not been in sight, because France and Great Britain had by now also reached a point where they weren't really able to defeat the Germans anymore. So this standoff could have carried on without end. The involvement of the USA had the decisive impact on the balance of power.
In September 1918, the time has finally come for the tank division led by George Patton. He's in the mix during the Allied offensive near Saint-Mihiel, to the south of Verdun. He's on foot, directing the approach of his 144 tanks. He's following his motto.
As long as a tank is maneuverable, it has to push forward. Its presence will save the lives of hundreds of infantrymen.
Even when his left leg is hit, Patton limps on until he can't continue and has to take cover in a bomb crater. His injury gives the ambitious commander the longed-for satisfaction of feeling like a war hero. Left to his own devices, he later claims a deep feeling of peace came over him. For the tank-supported US troops, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel becomes the first independently achieved success. The wounded man is recovered after a long 2 hours, once the barrage of gunfire calms down. For the tank officer who was so desperate to see action, the war is over. In so many ways, this is a war unlike any other before it. All sides are prepared to use any means available.
Alert! Go, hurry up!
In 1918, the use of poison gas reaches its climax. A third of the ammunition is filled with the gas, which paralyzes breathing and corrodes the lungs. On the 13th of October, a German private in Flanders is temporarily blinded by the poison gas. His frontline experience will have far-reaching effects.
The experience at close hand of this massive death and destruction must have left an imprint on Hitler. The impact of the First World War was to harden Hitler's views on the worth of, or the lack of worth, of human life. And to this extent, when he came out of the First World War, his view was probably the same that he expressed in the Second World War, which he was the main author of, that we should weep no tears for those who are dying here. They deserve to die, and they're dying in a cause. So I think this type of attitude, this social, almost this social Darwinist attitude, that survivors will survive, that the tough and the brave will survive and the others will go, there's no need to weep tears for them. This hard attitude probably was shaped by his experience in the First World War.
The war-weary German soldiers, who now surrender in droves, are described by a French officer.
They are emaciated, sometimes led by an officer who got away. They walk or stagger forward, supporting each other almost as if drunk, head down with a dark expression, their clothes as crusty as their faces.
If you've spent years in this meat grinder, the point would come when you would say, "I just want to save my life now." It was noticeable that thousands of German soldiers went into captivity without putting up much resistance. That hadn't been the case before.
The number of German captives in the West climbs to over 500,000. Dominic Richert is also set on escaping service at the front.
I think about how sad it would be if after all this awful, terrible stuff I was forced to participate in, I would still die here. I once read, "Our soldiers die for their fatherland with a smile on their faces." What a brazen lie. Who would want to smile faced by such a dreadful death? All those who come up with such speeches should be sent to the front line. In reality, there is no sign of courage. Mortal fear takes over all other feelings, and it's only under this terrible pressure that the soldiers push forwards. I don't think there's a single man here who would stay at the front of his own free will. They couldn't have cared less about the fatherland and would have just been desperate to save themselves.
Shortly afterwards, Dominik Richert saves his own life by fleeing into captivity. In the German Reich, there are few illusions left about the war. Hunger, shortages and epidemics, like Spanish flu, kill almost twice as many people here as all the bombs in World War II.
No one is thinking of victory anymore.
A police informer quotes from an overheard conversation.
Everything the papers write is lies and delusions. If we finish it now, we can still save a lot.
Eventually, there's a significant U-turn in the Belgian resort of Spa. Ludendorff surprises politicians and the general staff with a sort of admission of failure. His staff officer reports,
"The effect on the listeners was indescribable. While Ludendorff spoke, you could hear muted groans and sobs. Many, probably most, had tears streaming down their cheeks."
For a long time, Ludendorff didn't show his feelings. The only things that were noticeable were his tension and his temper tantrums. Only in September 1918 did he suddenly confront the political leadership with the realization the war is lost. We are going to have to negotiate a truce immediately. Hindenburg, too, argues that parties should take over the political power, that the civilians, and in particular the democratic parties, should face the music so that the military leadership would not be tainted by the odium of the defeat.
Democratic politicians like Philipp Scheidemann or Friedrich Ebert, who had until recently been reviled as unpatriotic, now become the administrators of a war policy that took the empire into the abyss. Society as a whole is going through a sea of change. In November, mutinous sailors in Kiel spark a widespread revolt by soldiers and workers against the ailing monarchy. Following in Ludendorff's footsteps, the German Kaiser is eventually also forced to abdicate under pressure from the revolution. On the 9th of November, the Social Democrat Scheidemann beats the socialist Karl Liebknecht to the proclamation of the Republic.
Long live change! Long live the German Republic!
It's the 11th of November. In a lounge car in Compiègne, near Paris, the representatives of this new democracy, many of whom were anything but in favor of the costly trench warfare, now sign the truce on behalf of the German Reich, rather than those responsible, the military leaders. That's why many compatriots later see them as the initiators of the defeat. The Allied negotiators wear uniform, and they leave the venue victorious. General Staff Officer Walter Model is hit abruptly by the end of the war, like a slap in the face. He had firmly believed until the end that all the effort hadn't been for nothing. And it seemed to him that civilians at home had ended the war that wasn't yet finished. Should the Allies not have properly defeated the Germans instead of making peace with them?
Well, we only know that the decision not to invade Germany in 1918 is going to have the effects it had with hindsight. And of course, some people were able to anticipate what might come, that Germany wouldn't feel the full force of military defeat as a consequence of the decision to stop short. What we have to remember is that by the autumn of 1918, the Allies logistically had run out of the capability to continue the advance.
The relief is felt on all sides. A German soldier gives his impressions of the truce.
All of a sudden, it stopped. There was deadly silence. We felt like newborns. The sun was out and the world was green. We regained hope. We would go home.
For the victims of the war, too, this is mainly a day of joy. On the 11th of November, the convalescent tank officer Patton laconically notes in his diary,
"I'm finally rid of my bandage. Have written a peace poem. Instead of these war trains, the little lives will blossom as before. Pale bloom of creatures, all too weak to bear the light of war."
A few days after the armistice, French troops arrive in Alsace-Lorraine, the area bitterly disputed by both neighbors. To avoid any future conflicts, the Allies create a buffer zone by occupying the region to the left of the Rhine, as well as the shorelines opposite Mainz, Koblenz, and Cologne. But what is first in the thoughts of most people on all sides of the borders is the end of a hopeless mass killing. A French soldier writes to his parents,
"So much pain is mixed with elation that one would like to cry. The soldier has lost his inner peace. They cannot yet imagine that this terrible fighting has really come to an end."
An entire generation will have to carry the permanent physical and mental scars of this war. Almost 9 million dead, including 2 million Germans, are left in the fiercely contested ground of the battlefields across the world. On the French side, every 6th conscript never returns to his wife and children, to his family, his home. And his homeland, too, has not been spared by this war.
10 million killed in the First World War, another 5 million in the aftermath of it, and famines and further fighting and so on. And violence directed against civilian populations then reached levels that had never been seen before. We've seen a third of the deaths in the First World War were civilian deaths, 2/3, I think, in the Second World War or something. So in this sense, it was an era that was characterized by violence.
Across large tracts of the country, the land is devastated in all aspects. The German front soldiers withdraw in an orderly fashion. The majority are in no doubts that there was nothing left to be won in this campaign.
New studies show clearly that the great majority of the German soldiers now believed never again another war. Most of the population also believed the war was lost. But over time, the idea managed to spread that they hadn't really been beaten in the field. So the German troops had to withdraw in 1918, but they had not yet been beaten.
When the tough conditions of the Treaty of Versailles become public and the new republic slides politically and economically into crisis, the opinion of the war changes.
A lot of the time, people were thinking, well, never again, never again another war. But the Nazi grouping were thinking, well, this war ended in disaster for Germany. We need another war to undo the consequence of the First World War. That was the view that gradually won over because the National Socialists were able to gain power.
Especially demagogues like Adolf Hitler feed off the discontent.
We reject this continual oppression, and we won't endure the austerity.
And so, following his successful campaign against France, the warlord stages the Truce of 1940 at exactly the same place as the Armistice of November 1918. It is an act of humiliation and revenge.
The German victory in 1940 was the big triumph for Germany. So they perceived it like, well, we fought 4 years against France in the First World War, and now the sons have achieved in 6 weeks what the fathers could not reach in the First World War in 4 years.
Hitler's teachings from his war experiences are now doctrine.
Of course, Hitler's views were to some extent formed in the First World War, shaped by them. So the notion that he comes out with that another war will be fought and this war will be fought to the end now and there'll be no capitulation as there was in the First World War, his entire leitmotif of his entire so-called career was that there could never be a repeat of what he called the cowardly capitulation of 1918. And in this sense, he was consistent in that the next time there's a defeat, Germany will then cease to exist. And in that sense, the German people don't deserve to survive because they haven't been proved to be strong enough. And the German people deserve to disappear.
Hitler's all-or-nothing doctrine is shared by his Field Marshal Model. The passionate professional soldier wants to avoid a repeat of 1918 at all costs, even when the desperate 1944 attempt to break through the Ardennes ends in a debacle with over 10,000 dead and 22,000 captive Wehrmacht soldiers. US Tank Division General Patton triumphs on this occasion. Even in 1945, Model continues to cling to his perseverance dogma. As such, he is typical of his generation of generals.
It's clearly those who fought in the Second World War more generally either had direct experience of the First World War or had a very strong received impression of the First World War. So the First World War had a role in shaping their outlook, undoubtedly.
Only when Model has been encircled in the Ruhr Basin by US troops and loses all commanding power over his forces does he realize what delusions he has been serving all this time. Now, when all is lost, he withdraws from facing his responsibility by committing suicide. With World War II, Hitler wanted to make amends for the First World War, but in the process unleashed a much more hellish conflagration.